Maybe you could speak to some of the dynamics of this. First of all, you were there in the early days, as I understand. How does a protest of this scale explode as it did? Like it starts with small groups of students, of the youth. Like maybe you can speak to in general from all the studying of youth protests. How does maybe anger, maybe um, ideological optimism, maybe the desire for revolution and for better times amongst a small group of students, how does that become a movement and how does that become a gigantic protest?
So protests were one of the things that some of the most impressive books I've been reading and about other places have been emphasizing is that protests are often preceded by other protests that may seem like dead ends, but actually provide people with the kind of skills and scripts and repertoires to then carry out things on a larger scale after that. So you often get we we get captivated by a moment that seems to come out of nowhere, but it often doesn't. The ground has been laid by it can be by an earlier generation that passes on the stories about it, or it can be just a few years before. And sometimes a new generation will say, look at what they did. That was exciting, but we want to put our mark on things by a generation. So there were these 1986 protests that sort of fizzled out that helped lay the groundwork for the 1989 ones. In Hong Kong, there were the 2012 and 2014 ones that laid the groundwork for 2019. Some of the times it was the same activists out on the streets again, but sometimes it was a younger generation who said, yeah, okay, but that failed. So what can we do differently? And we see this in cases in the US and we see it around the world of this kind of the percolating of things that happen, sometimes in conversations that continue, that happen. Um, and sometimes, failures can seem like dead ends, but over a long period of time, we see them as succeeding. And it can seem irrational. It can seem irrational to try to do something after the last three times people have tried to do it have failed. But then occasionally history shows that the third time or the fifth time or the 20th time actually does succeed. There's enough countervailing, In Eastern Europe, you would say, like in 1956, there was a rising, it was crushed. In 68, there were risings, crushed. Poland, 1981, it's martial law imposed. In 1989, what were East German protesters thinking when they poured out onto the streets? And then it happened. But this time it wasn't. So I think there's a way in which social movements are fundamentally unpredictable. And there are just times when, against all seeming odds, something that seemed like it would be there forever just no longer is.
And that's the case you make for when the odds seem impossible, it's still worthwhile.
It it doesn't mean that it will work. It doesn't mean that it will work, but I think history has enough examples of things that you thought. I mean, this is, and it explains why certain figures are so inspirational for generations of activists that, people read. There's a reason why people talk about Václav Havel. Whereas if Václav Havel had died in 1988, people would have said, "Oh, maybe he was a great writer, but his political project he didn't live to see come." But then he lives to 89 and becomes, against all expectations. So Rebecca Solnit, she's got a new book, "No Straight Road Takes You There: Essays for Uneven Terrain," and she's talking about taking a longer view of some struggles um, that seem that achieve things after the point when people might have imagined that they had run into dead ends. And she's talking about keeping your eye on the gains that happen, even incrementally, and the ways in which the need to take a longer term perspective on some of these things. And I think it's it's a strange thing because there's also often an impatience in movements of people wanting kind of immediate results. But as a historian looking at situations I've mentioned, sort of Eastern Europe and Central Europe, but Taiwan was a right-wing dictatorship under sort of a version of martial law for decades. And at each stage, it would seem that people struggling to change it um, were on a quixotic, impossible kind of mission. Or South Korea was in a similar situation. And then in the late 1980s, you start to have those things unravel. And it's partly because of a kind of steady resistance. It's partly because something in the world changes, but there's often a combination of those things. So I'm interested in that whole. We know that what happened in Hong Kong in the short run didn't work, and I don't see a way in which the national security law is reversed or anything like that. But that doesn't mean that it was a completely impossible effort, even though we know the result in that case was to have this failure.
So the protests are generally worthwhile. I mean, they do give, as I look at the description of the migratory routes ideas take, they do seed ideas in the minds of people, and then they live with those ideas and they share those ideas. They deliberate through those ideas. They might travel to different places of the world, and then those ideas return and rise up again and again and again. There's two parts of the world that I think are fascinating and unpredictable. So one is Iran, which the trajectory that place takes might have a completely transformative effect on the Middle East. And then the other one is China, where the protests, whether it's in Taiwan or Hong Kong, or maybe other influential parts of China, those ideas percolating up and up again might have a completely transformative effect on the world.
So maybe this is another case where the Chinese Communist Party, leaders in the Chinese Communist Party, they do know about history and they care about history. And one history they know is the Chinese Communist Party was almost destroyed in 1927. I mean, it was, if you were taking odds on what are the chances that this ragtag sort of group that's being pursued by Chiang Kai-shek to try to determine it, and yet over time they somehow managed to ride it out and eventually come to power. An awareness of the ways in which the seemingly impossible can happen. It doesn't mean it will. I mean, this is why I think, it's and one of the really kind of tragic or heartrending things is you can have situations in which movements that seem to be pursuing an impossible end result, they achieve that result. And then after another period, the country goes into another really difficult period, or it seems that the successes are being rolled back. And my new Milk Tea Alliance book that I've just written, I dedicate it to two people who've lived through a variety of these things. One is a Burmese activist who was involved in a failed uprising in 1988. He then was in exile who didn't know whether he could ever see his brothers who he loves back in Burma. And then something magical kind of changed. And in the 2010s, it seemed that there was a kind of democratization that turned out to be a false dawn. He was able to go back. And now he's again, when there's been a coup and a crackdown, he's now again cut off. And at one point, I was asking him about how he feels about this when he's still trying to sort of raise awareness globally about what's happening in Myanmar. And he said, I feel helpless, but not hopeless. I think, how does somebody maintain hope in that? And the other person I dedicated to, Miklas Rashti, as a Hungarian friend of mine, who was an activist before '89 and saw this amazing thing happen with communism, Communist Party rule ending. He was part of the process that came, and he was friends with Havel, and Havel's there, and Poland's changing, and all of this exhilarating moment. but ends up being a critic of Orban and following a tightening of control, rolling back of many of the things that were victorious then. But this kind of the no straight road, that actually there's something about it can be disquieting when these unexpected things are blows to where you thought direction history was going. But history just shows you that history doesn't have a direction. There isn't a straight road.
Yeah, and there's, the idealism of youth can lead to things like the Russian Revolution, and then you get Stalin with Holodomor and the purges and all of that entailed. So a successful protest and a successful revolution might have unintended consequences that far overshadow whatever ideals and dreams you had fighting for the working class, whatever it was in that particular case, that can cause immeasurable suffering. So there is no direction to history. There's just some lessons we pick up along the way, and we hopefully try to help humanity flourish. And we barely know what we're doing, and now we have nuclear weapons.
And some of it is also, though, sometimes the people who I find really admirable, it's not about trying to create totalistic change, but they focus on trying to do what they can for the things they believe in within constrained circumstances. And in Thailand, they've sort of hit a roadblock now again over kind of trying to bring about electoral change. A party that did really well was then disqualified. And some of the activists I know are focusing on local efforts to improve a neighborhood, to keep a neighborhood from suffering from a kind of unthinking gentrification. They're thinking small. They're thinking sometimes about just what can we do to improve the life of people within certain, how can we contribute to the kinds of social groups that might make some kind of incremental improvement to being the kind of world that we want to live in. People do that in all kinds of ways.
What kind of parallels can we draw between Taiwan and Hong Kong? What do you think are the people of Taiwan are thinking, looking at Hong Kong?
Well, I think the way that things developed in Hong Kong have undermined the kind of trust in any kind of story coming out of Beijing that there's a place within sort of Xi Jinping's version, at least of the People's Republic of China, for a place where people live very different kinds of lives. And I think a lot of people in Taiwan feel they're living a very different kind of life than on the mainland. So in that way, I think Hong Kong was an important example that way. And there were connections there was a Taiwan protest in 2014 before the big protests in Hong Kong by people who were young people who felt the government then was moving too much toward working together with Beijing. So they've been interconnected stories. And I think we sometimes miss how people within a region are looking at what other people in the region are doing and are taking clues from it about sort of how to agitate for the things they care about, what the risks are, what the dangers are. Autocrats within different parts of a region are looking at each other too, as well as globally.